Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Government scientists say that they know what the climate will be like in 100 years, but they're not so good at predicting it 2 weeks in the future. They also seem to have a lot of trouble remembering things which they said in the past. Mark Twain said, "If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything." At the end of January, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center predicted a warm February for the United States. That forecast didn't do too well, and we ended up having the coldest February in more than 30 years. Lots of people froze to death in Texas in the record cold. The Climate Prediction Center predicted hot temperatures in Texas, where temperatures can reach 90 or even 100 degrees during February. When Noaa's forecast failed, they tried to blame it on global warming. They said that global warming had disrupted the polar vortex. And they used this diagram to explain how global warming had caused a wavy jet stream. Note that this diagram is almost identical to the diagram used by Science News in 1975 to explain global cooling in the coming ice age. So apparently the symptoms of the global warming apocalypse and the global cooling apocalypse are exactly the same. Now let's look at Noaa's April forecast from less than 2 weeks ago. Once again, they predicted hot temperatures across most of the United States. And quite predictably, we're getting the exact opposite. Much of the United States is getting near record cold. The Climate Prediction Center can't predict 2 weeks in the future, but they're quite certain we're going to have a global warming apocalypse in the not too distant future. This is the current Noaa webpage. They say carbon dioxide levels now are higher than at any time in the past 3.6 million years, and they say that the first 3 months of 2021 brought a billion-dollar disaster and a warm start to spring for the U.S. The billion-dollar disaster which they're referring to is the record cold February, which they didn't predict. And the warm start to spring they're referring to is actually record cold. We're expecting a week of almost non-stop snow here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, starting this afternoon. Last month we had our second largest snowstorm on record here in Cheyenne after the blizzard of January 1949. We still have piles of snow on the ground from a month ago, and there's lots more snow coming this week. But Noaa says it's warm, and they say we're having a global warming apocalypse with the highest CO2 levels in almost 4 million years. If you click on this link, here's what comes up. They say, despite pandemic shutdowns, carbon dioxide and methane surged in 2020. Carbon dioxide levels are now higher than at any time in the past 3.6 million years. The atmospheric burden of CO2 is now comparable to where it was during the mid-Pliocene warm period around 3.6 million years ago, when concentrations of carbon dioxide ranged from about 380 to 450 parts per million. During that time, sea level was about 78 feet higher than today. The average temperature was 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher than in pre-industrial times, and studies indicate large forest-occupied areas of the Arctic that are now tundra. Human activity is driving climate change. If we want to mitigate the worst impacts, it's going to take a deliberate focus on reducing fossil fuel emissions to near zero, and even then we'll need to look for ways to further remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And they say that not only did CO2 levels surge over the past year, but methane levels surged as well. I will be discussing methane in more detail at the end of this video, but for now let's focus on CO2. Greenhouse gases surged to record levels during the lockdown. What Noaa seems to be admitting is that government has no control over the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Over the past 30 years, we've had dozens of international climate agreements and last year's lockdown where most people were kept in their homes. The airline industry was decimated, yet atmospheric CO2 levels continued to rise exponentially. It's 100% clear that Western governments who like to worry about CO2 have no control over it. Over the past 15 years, U.S. CO2 emissions have been declining, while China's emissions have been skyrocketing. The U.S. share of global emissions has been declining for more than 50 years, while they've been increasing in China. CO2 emissions across Asia have been rapidly increasing, while they've been decreasing in the United States and Europe. It's pretty clear that Asia's increases are dominating. Even Joe Biden's climate czar, John Kerry, admits that zero emissions in the U.S. wouldn't make any difference to the climate. But he's hopeful that China will collaborate with the United States to combat climate change. So let's go back to 7 years ago, the last time Joe Biden was in the White House. Barack Obama and Joe Biden signed an historic agreement with the Chinese to cut back on their CO2 emissions and limit climate change. China signed the agreement with Obama and Biden and then immediately started ignoring it. China is building new coal-fired power plants like crazy. And this has the BBC hysterical. They say that China coal power building boom sparks climate warning. And not only is China building lots of new coal-fired power plants, but they've also slashed their clean energy funding by 39%. And this all happened after Joe Biden's last historic agreement with the Chinese to cut back on their CO2 emissions. So Biden and the Chinese lied about their last agreement, but this time I'm sure they're telling us the truth. Now let's look at the Noaa article again. They talk about the atmospheric burden of CO2. If the Noaa scientists remembered their elementary school education, they would have known that carbon dioxide is actually the basis of all life on Earth. It's not a burden. They say that the last time CO2 levels were this high, sea level was 78 feet higher than today. So this time sea level is 78 feet lower and temperatures are 7 degrees cooler. That would seem to indicate that CO2 does not control sea level and it doesn't control temperature either. Then they go on and say that the last time CO2 levels were this high, large forests occupied areas of the Arctic that are now tundra. But we know that 5,000 years ago, when CO2 levels were much lower, forests also occupied large areas of what is now tundra. In fact, trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. CO2 levels were very low 5,000 years ago, yet the northern coastline of Russia may have been 2.5 to 7 degrees Celsius warmer than now. And the Arctic was ice-free 7,000 years ago when CO2 levels were much lower. If Noaa understood climate history, they would know that CO2 doesn't control Arctic forests and it doesn't control Arctic temperatures. And governments have been making the same ridiculous claims about sea level for decades. In 1989, a Commonwealth expert group said they were 90% certain that sea levels would rise between 1 and 4 meters by the year 2030. Since they made that forecast in 1989, sea level at Sydney, Australia has not increased by even 1 millimeter. But they were 90% certain of between 1,000 and 4,000 millimeters of sea level rise. For decades, climate scientists have been claiming certainty about things which they understand nothing about. Also in 1989, the United Nations predicted that the Maldives would be completely underwater within the next 30 years. That would have been 3 years ago. But the Maldives are booming, real estate prices there are skyrocketing, and they're building lots of new airports. In 1988, James Hansen at NASA started the global warming scare before Congress. He also predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater within 20 or 30 years, and that New York would be having a terrible drought. Neither of these things happened, but James Hansen is still a global warming hero among Democratic politicians. Yet I could write an entire book of James Hansen's failed climate forecasts. In 1989, the United Nations said that we only had 10 years to stop global warming, and if we didn't do it by the year 2000, entire nations would disappear under the seas. In 1989, they said we only had a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect. Of course, every 10 years, they push this 10-year window of opportunity back by 10 years. They've got to keep their scam alive, and with Joe Biden in the White House, they've got a strong advocate for the scam. Now let's look at Noaa's claims about methane. They say methane levels also surged last year. Analysis of samples from 2020 showed a significant jump in the atmospheric burden of methane, which is far less abundant but 28 times more potent than CO2 at trapping heat over a 100-year time frame. So what they're saying is that there was a record increase in the amount of methane despite the lockdowns. If we read between the lines, this tells us that government has no control over the amount of methane in the atmosphere. But what I'm going to discuss now is this claim that methane is 28 times more potent than CO2 at trapping heat over a 100-year time frame. If Noaa scientists bothered to study their own science, they would know that this claim of a 100-year time frame is nonsensical. The reason being that the average residence time of methane is only 9 years. How do you calculate methane's effect over 100 years if it's only in the atmosphere for 9 years? This makes no sense. This is a pretty direct contradiction, but there's lots more problems with their methane scare story than just that. The concentration of methane in the atmosphere is so low that climate modelers often don't even bother to simulate it. Methane occupies less than 2 parts per million of the atmosphere, which makes it almost inconsequential. I made this graph using the radiative transfer model used by the National Center for Atmospheric Research. The graph shows the amount of downwelling long-wave radiation, which is the greenhouse effect, for 3 different greenhouse gases with varying levels of concentration. The x-axis varies from 1/10 of current levels to 10 times current levels. The red line is water vapor. You can see that increasing amounts of water vapor in the atmosphere have a strong impact on the greenhouse effect. The yellow line is carbon dioxide. You can see that it has much less effect than water vapor. And the blue line is methane, which is almost completely flat. This shows us that even a huge increase in the amount of methane in the atmosphere has very little impact on the greenhouse effect. Now let's look at why water vapor dominates the greenhouse effect on Earth and why methane has so little effect. The gray areas here show the spectral bands of water vapor. Water vapor absorbs a very wide range of long-wave radiation frequencies. Carbon dioxide absorbs a much smaller range, and they largely overlap with the water vapor ranges. And methane has very small spectral bands, and they overlap with water vapor as well. So if there's a significant amount of water vapor in the atmosphere of a planet like there is on Earth, water vapor is going to, of course, dominate the greenhouse effect, and other species like methane will have very little effect. Unlike now, 50 years ago NASA was able to put people in space and they took pictures looking back at the Earth. Their pictures showed how water and water vapor dominate our planet and they dominate our climate. NASA, of course, can't put people in space anymore, but they've gotten very good at altering climate data to support government climate scams. Earth is unique because we have lots of water and lots of water vapor. And methane doesn't survive very long in our atmosphere because we have lots of oxygen. Any methane which leaks into the Earth's atmosphere quickly oxidizes into water vapor and carbon dioxide. That's why Noaa says the average residency time of methane is only 9 years, and it's also why methane will never be a serious contributor to the greenhouse effect on Earth. But other places in the solar system are different. This is a picture of Saturn's moon Triton. The surface of Triton and its atmosphere is dominated by methane. The reason Triton has a lot of methane in their atmosphere is because they don't have oxygen in the atmosphere for the methane molecules to bond with. On Triton, they have no government, and methane is the dominant greenhouse gas, but it certainly isn't important here on Earth. It's unfortunate that government climate scientists seem to understand so little about climate science. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this nonsense for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.